Okay, so you've brought some seriously interesting stuff for us to dive into today.
Yeah.
Specifically, we're looking at excerpts from a document all about DoD acquisition reform and commercial product treatment. And I got to say, this is a pretty dense topic,
Oh, yeah, it is.
but also pretty fascinating, right? We're talking about how the military buys things,
Absolutely.
which always has huge implications.
It's huge.
So let's jump right in. We're going to focus on one specific recommendation from the Forged Act,
Okay.
which, as you know, is this big piece of legislation aiming to shake things up in defense acquisition.
Right.
And this recommendation we're honing in on today is all about how certain products and services
Yeah.
basically have to be treated as commercial items.
That's the one.
So our mission for this deep dive is to break this down for you, the listener, and give you a solid understanding of what this change means,
Right.
why it's being proposed, and most importantly, how you can prepare for its potential impact.
Definitely. That's key.
Because we know you're the ones who are actually going to have to implement these changes on the ground.
Exactly.
So let's get into the nitty-gritty.
Yeah.
Right? Section 304 of the Forge Act. What does it actually say?
Well, at its core,
Yeah.
it's amending Title 10 of the U.S. Code, specifically Section 3457.
Okay, Title 10 U.S. Code, for those who might not be familiar, that's the main body of law
Yeah, that's right.
that governs the armed forces, right?
Yeah, governs the military, all their rules and regulations.
Exactly.
And this specific section, 3457, this is where things get interesting.
Okay, lay it on us.
So basically, this section is now saying that certain products and services shall be treated as commercial items.
Shall.
Shall, that's the key word here.
So not, may not, could.
No, it's a mandate.
It's got to happen.
It's got to happen, and this is a pretty big departure from how things have been done in the past,
So previously, there was probably a lot more wiggle room.
right? Oh, yeah, there was definitely more discretion.
Like a contracting officer could decide on a case-by-case basis
Exactly.
whether something was commercial or not.
Yeah.
Yep. But now with this shall language,
It's like they're drawing a line in the sand.
they're saying, no, for these specific things, you got to go the commercial route.
And that's not all.
There's more.
Oh, yeah, there's a whole new layer of accountability being added here.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So if the DoD wants to say, hey, for this particular item, even though it falls under this new mandate, we don't think it should be treated as commercial,
Yeah.
they have to provide a written justification,
A written justification.
like a formal document explaining why they're asking for a waiver.
So it's not just a, hey, we don't feel like it kind of thing.
No, not anymore. They got to have their ducks in a row and provide solid reasoning.
Okay, so it seems like they're really trying to make it harder to deviate from this commercial treatment approach.
Yeah, absolutely. This is not just a suggestion anymore. This is serious business.
And you know, when I look at this, it just screams efficiency.
Yeah.
It feels like a big push to cut through all that red tape we always hear about in defense acquisition.
You hit the nail on the head. They're trying to streamline things
Make it faster, make it simpler.
and hopefully save some money in the process.
Right, because time is money, especially in the world of defense.
Couldn't agree more.
But let's take a step back for a second.
Sure.
Because this idea of using commercial practices in DoD acquisition, this isn't new.
Not at all, actually.
This has been a recurring theme for a while now.
It has.
So where did this whole push even begin?
Well, based on the documents you've provided,
Yeah.
we can trace it back to the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act of 1994.
1994, that's going back a bit.
It is, but it shows how long this concept has been around.
So what was the main idea behind that act back then?
The goal was pretty simple. They wanted to make the DoD acquisition process more like what you see in the commercial world.
To tap into that speed and efficiency that businesses are always striving for.
Exactly. And also to take advantage of the innovation that's often happening in the commercial sector,
Right, because commercial companies are often on the cutting edge.
especially when it comes to technology.
So they saw this potential to bring those same benefits into defense acquisition.
And if anyone wants to learn more about this 1994 Act,
Yeah?
there's a ton of information on the Congressional Research Service website, crsreports.congress.gov.
So the intent was there back in the 90s.
It was.
But it seems like putting it into practice has been a bit more challenging.
Oh, yeah. There have been a lot of roadblocks along the way.
It's like the idea was great on paper,
Uh-huh.
but actually making it work in the real world.
That's where things got tricky.
So what were some of the biggest obstacles they ran into?
Well, the Government Accountability Office, the GAO.
Oh, yeah, the GAO. They're like the watchdogs of Congress.
Exactly. They're the ones who audit government programs and make sure things are running efficiently.
Right. They keep everyone honest.
And they've issued a bunch of reports over the years highlighting these persistent barriers to using commercial items.
And what were some of those barriers?
One of the biggest issues was the way they defined commercial. The definitions were often so narrow and restrictive.
So even if something was basically the same as what you'd buy in a store,
Yeah,
it might not have qualified as commercial under these DoD rules.
that's right. And this really limited the DoD's ability to actually take advantage of commercial products and services.
It's like they were tying their own hands.
In a way, they were. And this ended up hindering innovation and slowing down the whole acquisition process.
So it was counterproductive.
Totally. And you can find more about these GAO reports and the challenges they identified on the Defense Technical Information Center website, discover.daec.mil.
So these restrictive rules might have actually pushed away some of those innovative, non-traditional companies.
That's a very real possibility. They were essentially saying, hey, if you don't fit into our very specific box, you can't play with us.
And that's a shame because the DoD could really benefit from those outside perspectives.
Absolutely. Those non-traditional companies often bring fresh ideas and new approaches.
Which is exactly what the DoD needs to stay ahead of the curve.
Agreed.
So fast forward to 2016,
Okay.
the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, they tried to address some of these issues.
They did. They included provisions to broaden the preference for commercial items.
Okay, so they recognized the problem and tried to fix it.
They did, but according to defense.gov histories, the implementation of those changes, it didn't really go as planned.
So another good idea that got bogged down in the execution.
Exactly. It's like they took a step in the right direction, but then kind of stalled out.
And then to add fuel to the fire, the Defense Science Board, they issued a pretty scathing critique.
They did?
About how these non-commercial rules were actively discouraging companies from working with the DoD.
Which is a huge problem.
Huge. Because the DoD needs access to the best of the best.
Absolutely. They can't afford to be turning away talented suppliers.
And the Defense Science Board, their website is dsb.cco.mil if anyone's interested in reading their reports.
Yeah, lots of good insights there.
So I've got the GAO, the NDAA, and the Defense Science Board.
All raising similar concerns.
All saying, hey, this commercial item thing isn't working as well as it should.
And that brings us to Section 304 of Senate Bill 5618.
Introduced in late 2024.
Yeah, this is the latest attempt to address these long-standing issues.
And there's some good info on this on the innovation.defense.gov website, framing this as a direct response to all those previous efforts.
And this shift from may to shall that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, that's significant.
It is. Along with those stricter requirements for waivers, it really shows a more determined effort to align DoD acquisition with commercial practices.
They're not messing around this time.
Nope. They're serious about making this work.
Okay, so we've covered the what and the why.
Yep.
Now let's talk about what are the potential benefits of all this? What are they hoping to achieve?
Well, there are 5 main desired effects that they've laid out.
5? Okay, let's break those down.
So the first one, and we've touched on this already, is simplification.
Simplification of what?
Of the whole procurement process.
They want to cut through the red tape.
Exactly. They want to reduce the bureaucracy, make things easier and faster.
Because the logic is that commercial item acquisitions, they're inherently less complex.
Right. They don't come with all the baggage of traditional DoD contracts.
Think about it. When the government buys office supplies, it's a pretty straightforward process.
Pretty much.
But when they're buying some highly specialized piece of military equipment,
oh, man, that's a whole different ballgame.
It's a nightmare of paperwork and regulations.
And so the goal here is to try to shift more acquisitions closer to that office supplies end of the spectrum.
Make it more like buying something on Amazon.
As much as possible, yes.
Which brings us to the second desired effect, faster acquisition timelines.
Yeah, if they can leverage the efficiencies of the commercial world, they should be able to get stuff into the hands of the warfighter a lot quicker.
Which is critical because technology is evolving so rapidly these days.
Absolutely. You can't afford to be stuck in a procurement process that takes years.
By the time you get the equipment, it's already obsolete.
Exactly. So speed is of the essence.
And the third desired effect?
Expanding the supplier pool.
Okay, so basically getting more companies involved.
Exactly, by making it easier and more attractive for commercial companies to work with the DoD.
They're hoping to attract a whole new wave of suppliers.
That's the idea, and this could be huge because it could bring in companies with specialized skills and technologies
that the DoD might not even know about right now.
That's right, they could tap into a whole new world of innovation.
Which brings us to the fourth desired effect, lower costs.
Yeah, if they can get more competition into the mix,
Uh-huh.
they should be able to drive down prices.
Because competition always breeds innovation and lower prices.
Exactly. And this is especially important when you're talking about taxpayer dollars.
Right. The DoD has a responsibility to be good stewards of those funds.
And getting the best value for their money.
So lower costs, it's a big win for everyone.
It is.
And the fifth and final desired effect.
Enhanced access to innovation.
Okay, so this is all about staying ahead of the curve.
Yeah, the commercial sector is where a lot of the cutting-edge stuff is happening.
Especially in areas like AI and cyber.
Absolutely.
And the DoD needs to be able to tap into that.
They do if they want to maintain their technological advantage.
So by aligning their acquisition processes more closely with the commercial world,
they're hoping to be able to adopt these new technologies much faster.
it's like they need to be able to move at the speed of business.
Exactly.
Okay, so those are the potential upsides.
Yep.
But we also have to be realistic.
Of course.
There are always potential downsides to any major change.
There are.
And this is no exception.
Right.
So what are some of the key negative impacts that we need to consider?
Well, one big concern is the risk of overclassification.
Overclassification meaning?
Meaning that in their eagerness to streamline things, they might start labeling too many items as commercial.
Even if they're not really appropriate for that designation.
Exactly. And this could lead to a situation where they're bypassing important government oversight.
Which could potentially compromise quality.
Yes, because some items just require a higher level of scrutiny.
Especially when you're talking about things that could impact national security.
Absolutely. So there's a real need to find that balance.
Between speed and safety.
Exactly.
And the second potential downside.
Well, remember how we talked about the new requirement for written justification for waivers?
Yeah. That's supposed to add accountability?
It is, but it could also backfire.
How so?
If the waiver process becomes too cumbersome, it could actually slow things down even more.
So it's like creating a new bottleneck.
Potentially, yes. And that would defeat the whole purpose of trying to streamline things.
So they need to make sure that waiver process is efficient and user-friendly?
Absolutely.
And the third potential negative impact?
This one's a biggie. It's the potential disruption to traditional defense suppliers.
Okay, so these are the companies that have been working with the DoD for years.
Yeah, they're the ones who know the ins and outs of the current system.
And they might not be as well equipped to compete in this new commercial environment.
That's right. They might struggle to adapt.
Which could lead to them losing business?
Yeah, and that could have a ripple effect throughout the defense industrial base.
It could destabilize the whole system.
Potentially, yes. So it's something that needs to be carefully managed.
And the fourth potential downside?
Misclassification.
Misclassification meaning?
Meaning that they might accidentally label something as commercial when it's not.
Because they didn't do their homework.
Exactly. If they don't do thorough market research, they might not realize that true commercial competition doesn't actually exist for a particular item.
So they end up paying way more than they should.
Yeah, it's like going to a fancy boutique and buying something you could have gotten at Walmart.
Except it's taxpayer money we're talking about.
Right. So market research is going to be super important.
They got to know what they're doing.
Absolutely.
And the fifth and final potential downside.
This one's a bit sensitive, but it has to be addressed.
I'm listening.
There's a risk that this shift towards commercial item treatment could lead to a weakening of accountability.
And potentially even an increase in fraud.
Yeah, because with less oversight, there are more opportunities for things to slip through the cracks.
So it's like a trade-off between efficiency and accountability.
In a way, it is.
Okay, so we've got a pretty clear picture of the potential risks.
Yep.
But the million-dollar question is, what are they going to do about it?
Right.
What are their strategies for mitigating these downsides?
Well, they've actually got some pretty specific plans in place.
Okay, good, because I was starting to get worried.
So for the overclassification issue,
Yeah, that's a big one.
they're focusing on establishing clear quality benchmarks for anything that gets classified as commercial.
So even though the acquisition process might be streamlined, they're still going to hold those items to a high standard.
Absolutely.
No cutting corners on quality.
Nope, quality's still paramount.
What about that potential bureaucratic nightmare with the waivers?
Yeah, that's a valid concern.
So how are they going to present that?
Their strategy is to make the waiver process as streamlined as possible.
Okay, so efficient and transparent.
Exactly. They want to have clear criteria for when a waiver is needed, and they want to set strict timelines for decision-making.
So no more waiting around for months on end.
Hopefully not.
And what about those traditional defense suppliers?
Yeah, the ones who might be feeling a bit left out.
So they're not just going to abandon them?
No, they're planning to offer some transition support.
Okay, what does that look like?
It could involve things like training programs, resources to help them adapt to the new environment.
Like maybe helping them understand how to compete for commercial item contracts?
Exactly, or maybe helping them find new opportunities within the DoD.
So they're not being left out in the cold?
Nope, they're being given a helping hand.
And what about the risk of misclassification?
Yeah, that one's all about training.
Training.
Training the DoD acquisition workforce.
So basically giving them the knowledge and skills they need to do their jobs properly.
Exactly. They need to be experts in market research. They need to be able to identify fair and reasonable prices.
So they don't end up overpaying for stuff.
Right.
And the final risk, the accountability and fraud issue.
Yeah, that one's tricky.
Because you don't want to stifle innovation with too much oversight,
That's right.
but you also don't want to open the door to corruption.
So how do you find that balance?
Exactly.
Well, their plan is to implement a system of random audits.
Okay, so spot checks, basically.
Yeah, they'll be keeping an eye on things, but not in a way that's overly burdensome.
So they're trying to deter fraud without creating a whole new bureaucracy.
That's the goal.
It's all about finding that sweet spot.
It is.
Okay, so they've got plans to address all the potential risks.
They do.
Now let's talk about the people.
Okay.
Who within the DoD is going to be most affected by all of this?
Well, the recommendation specifically calls out a few groups.
Okay, who are they?
First up, contracting officers.
They're the ones on the front lines.
Yeah, they're the ones who are actually negotiating and awarding contracts.
So their jobs are going to change quite a bit.
Oh, yeah. They're gonna need a whole new set of skills.
Because they'll be dealing with more commercial items.
Right. They need to be able to evaluate commercial viability. They need to understand commercial market dynamics.
It's a different mindset.
It is.
So they're going to need some serious training.
Definitely.
Heads of contracting activity.
Okay, so those are the folks who oversee the contracting process.
Exactly.
What's going to change for them?
Well, they're probably going to be dealing with a lot more waiver requests.
Because remember, anyone who wants to deviate from the commercial treatment mandate, they got to get a waiver.
And those waivers have to be approved by the head of the contracting activity.
So their workload is going to increase.
Most likely, and they'll be making some pretty important decisions.
About whether to grant those waivers or not.
Exactly.
So they're going to be under a lot of pressure. Yeah, they'll be in the hot seat.
And what about the rest of the acquisition workforce?
Well, everyone's going to have to adapt to these new, faster-paced workflows.
Because remember, the whole point is to streamline things.
Right. So they're going to need to be more agile and efficient.
Maybe even change some of their existing processes.
Potentially, yes.
So it's going to be a big cultural shift.
It is.
Okay, so we've got the contracting officers, the heads of contracting activities, and the broader acquisition workforce.
All affected in different ways.
Now let's talk about potential pushback.
Okay.
Who's likely to oppose this recommendation?
Well, I think it's safe to say that traditional defense contractors might not be thrilled about it.
Because their bread and butter has been those non-commercial contracts.
Exactly. They've built their whole business model around the existing system.
And now the rug is being pulled out from under them.
In a way, it is. So they might try to resist these changes.
They might lobby against it or try to water it down.
That's a possibility.
And who else might push back?
DoD auditors.
Okay, they're the ones who are all about accountability.
Yeah, they're going to be concerned about any changes that they perceive as weakening oversight.
And they might have a point.
They might.
Because with less scrutiny comes more risk.
That's true. So they're going to be watching this very closely.
And the third potential source of opposition?
Congressional overseers.
The folks on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, they're ultimately responsible for the DoD's budget.
And they're going to want to make sure that taxpayer money is being spent wisely.
Exactly. So they're going to be asking a lot of questions.
They're going to want to see proof that this new system is actually working.
And they're going to want to make sure that there are safeguards in place to prevent abuse.
So it's going to be a tough sell.
It might be. But if the DoD can demonstrate the benefits and address those concerns about accountability, they might be able to win them over.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed.
Okay, so we've got potential opposition from industry and internal watchdogs in Congress.
Yeah.
It's going to be an uphill battle.
It might be.
But let's assume for a moment that they managed to get everyone on board.
Okay.
What kind of resources are they going to need to actually make this thing work?
Well, first and foremost, they're going to need better market research tools.
Because remember, we talked about the risk of misclassification.
Yeah, if they don't have accurate data on commercial prices and availability, they're going to make some costly mistakes.
So they need to invest in the right technology and expertise?
Absolutely.
And what else?
That's training.
For the acquisition workforce.
Yes. They need to make sure that everyone understands the new rules and processes.
And that they know how to conduct effective market research.
Exactly.
So it's a huge investment in human capital.
It is, but it's essential.
And the third resource they're going to need...
Your people.
More people. For what?
Well, they're going to need more staff to handle those waiver requests and to conduct those random audits.
So more bodies on the ground.
Yeah, to make sure everything is running smoothly.
Okay, so it's not just a policy change.
Yep.
It's a resource allocation challenge as well.
It is.
They're going to need more money, more people, and more training.
If they want to make this thing a success.
And speaking of success,
yeah,
how will they even know if it's working?
Right. They need to have some metrics in place.
Some way to measure the impact.
Exactly.
So what are those metrics?
Well, they've identified 3 key performance indicators.
Okay, 3 KPIs. Let's hear 'em.
The first one is the percentage increase in commercial item contracts.
Okay, so they're literally going to be tracking how many contracts are being awarded for commercial items.
Yeah, and their goal is to see a 25% increase.
So a pretty ambitious target.
It is, but it shows how serious they are about this.
And the second KPI?
Reduction in procurement timelines.
Okay, so they're going to be measuring how long it takes to get things from start to finish.
Exactly. And their goal is to reduce those timelines by an average of 20%.
So that's a direct measure of efficiency.
It is.
And the third KPI?
Supplier diversity.
Okay, so they're not just focused on speed and cost.
Well,
they also want to broaden the industrial base.
Right. They want to see more new companies coming into the fold.
And their goal is to increase the number of new vendors by at least 15%.
That's right.
So it's a holistic approach to measuring success.
It is.
They're looking at the big picture.
Absolutely.
Okay, so those are the metrics.
Yep.
Now, before we wrap this up,
yeah,
I want to ask about alternative approaches.
Okay.
Were there any other options on the table?
There were, actually.
Besides this mandatory commercial treatment thing?
Yeah.
So what were they?
Well, one alternative was to focus on making the existing regulations more flexible.
Okay, so tweaking the current system instead of overhauling it.
Exactly. They could have tried to give contracting officers more leeway to use commercial practices without making it a requirement.
So a more gradual approach.
Yeah.
And the other alternative?
A pilot program.
A pilot program, meaning?
Meaning they could have tested this out on a smaller scale first.
Okay, so like pick a few categories of items.
Yeah.
And see how the commercial treatment approach worked in practice.
Exactly. And then use those lessons learned to refine the policy before rolling it out more broadly.
So a more cautious approach.
Yeah.
But they decided to go all in.
They did.
With the mandatory commercial treatments.
It's a bold move.
It is. Okay, so to sum up this deep dive.
Yeah.
Section 304 of the Forge Act. It's a big deal.
It is.
They're trying to change the way the DoD buys things.
In a fundamental way.
By making it more like the commercial world.
Exactly.
They want to be faster, more efficient, more innovative.
And save money in the process.
Right. But there are risks.
There are.
They could compromise quality. They could create new bureaucracies.
Yeah.
They could alienate traditional defense suppliers.
That's right.
They could overpay for things.
And they could even open the door to fraud.
So it's a high-stakes gamble.
It is.
But they're putting a lot of thought and effort into mitigating those risks.
They are.
And they're going to be tracking their progress very closely.
With those KPIs we talked about.
Exactly. So for you, the listener,
yeah,
this is something you need to be paying attention to.
Absolutely.
Because it's going to affect your job.
In one way or another.
So start thinking about how you can prepare.
Yeah.
What skills do you need to develop? What processes need to change?
What resources do you need?
Because the future of defense acquisition is changing.
It is.
And you need to be ready.
Now, one final thought for you to ponder.
Okay, hit me.
Given all this talk about efficiency and innovation and the need for oversight and accountability, what do you think is going to be the biggest challenge in implementing this recommendation?
That's a good question.
What are the potential roadblocks that you see?
And what are the specific areas that are going to require the most attention?
To make sure they get this right.
That's something for you to think about.
And as we mentioned earlier, this is just one piece of the puzzle.
Right.
The Forged Act is a huge piece of legislation. So if you want to stay ahead of the curve...
Yeah, I encourage you to explore the rest of the act.
See how all the pieces fit together.
And be sure to join us for future deep dives.
Where we'll be breaking down other key recommendations.
From the Forged Act.
Because knowledge is power.
It is.
And the more you know...
the better prepared you'll be for the future.
Couldn't said it better myself. Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.